30 years ago, deep in the misty forests along the Washington-Oregon border, a young logger named Frank stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist. A baby Bigfoot, trapped and crying for help. He could have walked away, but instead, he saved it. What happened that day became the greatest secret of his life. For decades, Frank believed he'd never see the creature again. But one snowy winter morning, something moved at the edge of the trees, tall, silent, and familiar. What followed proved that the forest never forgets kindness, and that even a Bigfoot remembers its first friend. Frank had spent most of his 25 years tucked away in the forests along the Washington-Oregon border. He was a quiet logger, the kind of man who preferred the sound of wind through cedar branches to the noise of any town. His days were simple, cutting timber, fishing the creeks, and keeping to himself in a small cabin he built by hand. One rainy spring evening, as he made his way home from a hunting trip, he heard a sound that stopped him cold. It wasn't human, yet not quite animal either, a desperate, broken cry echoing through the dripping ferns. Curiosity pushed past fear, and Frank followed the noise through the thick undergrowth. Then he saw it, something unbelievable, caught in the barbed wire near a fallen tree. Frank froze where he stood, the rain dripping off the brim of his hat. At first, he thought it might be a bear cub caught in the wire, but as he stepped closer, the sight nearly took his breath away. The creature was small, no more than 3 feet tall. Its fur thick and dark brown, matted with mud and streaks of blood. Its arms were longer than a child's, its hands wide and rough, but the face looked disturbingly human. It whimpered softly, eyes wide with fear, breathing in quick, shallow bursts. For a moment, Frank's instincts screamed at him to run. Whatever it was, he wasn't meant to be this close to it. But the sound of its pain stopped him in his tracks. He crouched low, whispering gently, trying to calm it down. "Easy now. I'm not gonna hurt you," he said quietly. With slow hands, Frank pulled out his hunting knife and began cutting the wire wrapped around its leg and arm. The creature tensed but didn't fight back. Its dark eyes followed his every move, shining with something that felt almost like understanding. Finally, the last strand of barbed wire snapped free. The little creature slumped to the ground, too weak to stand. Frank knelt beside it, unsure what to do next. It blinked up at him once, gave a faint, trembling sigh, and then went still, not dead, but completely exhausted. Frank hesitated, scanning the forest around him. The woods had gone quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of his own heartbeat. He knew something bigger might be nearby, maybe even the creature's parents. Still, he couldn't leave it there. He slipped off his heavy jacket, wrapped the small body inside, and lifted it gently into his arms. The creature was warm, heavier than he expected, its breathing shallow but steady. Frank looked over his shoulder one last time, half expecting something to charge out of the fog. Nothing moved. With his heart pounding hard enough to feel in his throat, he started back toward his cabin, every step echoing with the weight of what he had just done, saving something the world wasn't supposed to see. Frank laid the small creature on an old wool blanket near the wood stove. The cabin was dimly lit, filled with the smell of pine smoke and rain-soaked leather. He knelt beside it, unsure if it would make it through the night. Its breathing was shallow, but its eyes were open, alert, frightened, and curious all at once. He warmed a tin cup of milk on the stove, mixed in a spoon of honey, and let it cool before setting it down beside the creature. For hours, it didn't move, just stared at him with cautious eyes, every muscle tense, ready to bolt if he made a wrong move. Frank spoke softly, telling it simple things: how the storm would pass, how it was safe here. Finally, the creature's small hand reached for the cup. It sniffed, then began to sip, slow at first, then faster. Frank exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. By morning, it had strength enough to sit up and look around. It made small sounds, soft hums and clicks, and watched Frank closely as he moved about the cabin. When he scratched his beard, it copied him. When he took a drink, it mimed the action. That mimicry made him smile. He decided to call it Willow, after the grove of trees that stood just beyond his cabin. Strong, gentle, and quietly alive. Over the next few days, Willow regained energy quickly. She followed Frank everywhere, sometimes tugging at his pant leg or curiously touching his tools. When he chopped wood, she'd gather the small pieces and pile them nearby. She never tried to leave, though she often gazed toward the forest, listening. Frank knew she didn't belong in a cabin. She belonged out there, among the trees and shadows. But every time she looked up at him with those dark, trusting eyes, he felt something stir in his chest, a sense of responsibility, even affection. He told himself he'd let her go when she was stronger, but in truth, he wasn't sure he could. It was early morning when Frank heard the first sound, long, deep, and rolling through the valley like thunder. It wasn't wind. It wasn't any animal he knew. Willow froze where she was, halfway through chewing a piece of fruit. Her head snapped toward the window, her eyes wide and alert. Then came another call, lower, closer. A shiver ran down Frank's spine. He stepped to the door and listened. The forest was answering itself, echoing with strange, haunting tones. Willow began pacing, whimpering, her small hands pressing against the doorframe. Frank knew what it meant before he even said it out loud. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" She turned her head toward him, letting out a soft, almost pleading sound. He didn't need words to understand. Frank took a deep breath, then reached for his jacket. "All right, little one, it's time." He carried her out into the morning fog, following the echoes through the dripping pines. His boots sank into the soft moss as the forest grew unnervingly silent again. Then, ahead of him, a massive shadow moved between the trees. Out of the mist stepped a towering figure nearly 9 feet tall, broad-shouldered, covered in thick, dark fur. A female Bigfoot, unmistakably the same kind as Willow. She stood still, watching him, her dark eyes calm but filled with emotion he couldn't quite name. Frank set Willow down gently. The little one hesitated, then let out a soft, chirping sound and ran toward the giant figure. The mother crouched, scooping her child into her arms. Before turning to leave, Willow twisted around and looked back at Frank. She gave a low, trembling cry, one that sounded almost human. The mother met his eyes once more and gave a slow nod, not a threat, but gratitude. Then she turned and vanished into the forest with her child. Frank stood there for a long time, staring into the mist where they had gone. When he finally walked home, the forest felt quieter than ever. He knew nothing would ever be the same again. Frank never spoke a word about what happened that morning in the woods. Who would believe it? A logger claiming he'd saved a baby Bigfoot. He could already hear the laughter, the looks, the questions he'd never be able to answer. So, he locked the memory away, keeping it his own private truth. Life went on. Seasons passed, trees fell, and grew again. And Frank kept working in the same patch of forest he'd always known. He fixed his cabin roof each spring, stocked firewood every fall, and lived a quiet life far from anyone who'd care about the strange things hidden in the hills. Sometimes, on still nights, he'd sit by the fire and hear faint, distant calls carried on the wind. Low, drawn-out sounds that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He'd step outside, look into the dark timberline, and tell himself it was just the wind moving through the canyons. But deep down, a small part of him knew better. Years blurred together, his hair grayed, his face hardened with lines carved by weather and work. Friends moved away or passed on, and the forest became his truest companion. He never married, never left. Something about those woods held him there, maybe the memory of that small creature he once saved. Sometimes he'd catch himself glancing toward the grove of willows behind the cabin, half expecting to see a flash of dark fur or two shining eyes watching from the shadows. But nothing ever came. Then, one winter morning nearly 30 years after that day, something changed. The snow had been falling since before dawn, heavy and wet, blanketing the valley in white. Frank stepped outside to chop wood, the air sharp and biting against his face. That's when he heard it, a sound he hadn't heard in 3 decades. Deep, resonant, and powerful. Not a coyote, not a bear. It rolled across the frozen hills, steady and deliberate. Frank froze, the axe still in his hand. For a long moment, he didn't breathe. The sound came again, closer this time, a call that stirred something buried deep inside him. He knew that voice. After 30 long years, Willow had returned. The morning was quiet, the kind of silence that only heavy snow can bring. Frank, now 55, worked slowly outside his cabin, splitting wood in the crisp air. Each swing of the axe sent a dull thud echoing through the trees. His breath hung in the cold, white mist. He was halfway through his pile when he heard it, a deep, deliberate crunch of snow from somewhere behind him. He paused, listening. Another step followed, heavier this time. Frank's first thought was a bear. He gripped the axe tighter and turned slowly toward the sound. What he saw made his chest tighten. At the edge of the tree line, half shrouded by falling snow, stood a massive figure, tall, broad, and covered in thick fur that glistened under the pale winter light. Its shoulders rose and fell with slow, steady breaths. The creature didn't move, didn't threaten. It only watched him. Frank's heart hammered in his chest. His first instinct was fear, but that vanished the moment he saw something familiar. A faint scar on its upper arm, old but unmistakable. The exact spot where the barbed wire had once cut deep into a baby's flesh, decades ago. His throat tightened. "Willow?" he whispered. The creature tilted her head slightly, just as the little one used to do when she didn't understand a word. A soft, low rumble came from her chest, not anger, not warning, but something almost gentle. Snowflakes drifted between them, landing silently on the ground. Frank took a careful step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. She didn't move away. Her expression, if such a thing could be called, that carried a strange calm, as if she, too, were remembering. The forest seemed to fade away around them. No sound, no wind. Just the two of them standing still in the snowfall, a man and the creature he once saved, meeting again after 30 long years. Frank felt a tremor of awe, disbelief, and something deeper, a quiet recognition that whatever bond they had formed so long ago had never truly been broken. Time itself seemed to stop as they simply looked at one another, both knowing what this moment meant. Frank's heart beat slow and heavy in the still air. His, breath clouds in the cold, his hands trembling as he reaches into his coat pocket. From it, he pulls a single red apple, the same fruit Willow once adored all those years ago. Without a word, he rolls it gently across the snow. The apple bumps to a stop at her feet. Willow bends down, her massive hand wrapping around it with surprising care. She examines it, brings it close to her nose, then makes a soft, almost musical hum sound. Frank remembers from when she was small. She takes a bite, and the crunch echoes softly through the quiet forest. Frank laughs through tears. "You still like those, huh?" he whispers, his voice trembling between joy and disbelief. Willow steps forward, slow and deliberate, until she's close enough that Frank can see her eyes deep, intelligent, and filled with something that feels like recognition. Then, she leans down and lowers her massive head. Gently, carefully, she rests her forehead against his. Frank closes his eyes. In that single moment, the years vanish. She's that small, frightened creature again. And he's the man who refused to let her die. Behind her, two younger Bigfoots stand quietly, watching with calm patience her family now. Willow turns her head toward them, then back to Frank, her eyes soft and almost human. It's not just a farewell, it's gratitude. She exhales softly, a warm mist between them, then turns and begins walking toward the forest. Before the shadows swallow her, she looks over her shoulder one last time, a silent promise that she remembers. Frank stands there long after she's gone, snow falling softly around him. Frank never tells a soul about her return. Some things, he decides, are too sacred to be spoken, too fragile to survive the disbelief of others. That winter, he begins leaving small gifts near the forest's edge: apples, carrots, and sometimes jars of honey wrapped in cloth. By morning, they're always gone, not stolen, not trampled, simply taken with care. It becomes his quiet ritual, his unspoken way of saying "I remember." On calm evenings, when the wind hushes through the trees, he sometimes feels it, that faint, watchful presence, just beyond sight. He never feels fear, only peace. As years pass, the forest grows older with him. The cabin weathers, the seasons change, but Frank never stops leaving those offerings. He grows gray, slower, but content, knowing that somewhere in the endless green, Willow lives free, wild, and happy. And though they never meet again, he believes their hearts stayed connected through the earth, the silence, and the kindness that once bridged two worlds. A bond born from compassion, he knows, never truly ends. It simply lives on in memory and in the whispering woods that keep their secret. After Frank's passing, the cabin stands quiet for a while until his nephew, Daniel, decides to move in. The place feels peaceful, though strangely watchful, as if the forest itself is aware of him. Not long after, Daniel notices odd things. The fruit bowl he leaves on the porch keeps emptying overnight. Heavy footprints, far too large to be human, appear in the snow leading to the tree line. Sometimes, late at night, he hears slow, steady footsteps outside, then nothing but silence. The locals tell him it's bears or coyotes. Daniel nods, but deep down, he isn't convinced. He remembers the old stories his uncle hinted at, the friend in the woods no one believed in. Each winter, those signs return: the missing apples, the tracks, the feeling of being quietly watched but never threatened. People in town say it's nonsense, but Daniel knows better. Some bonds never die. And if you listen closely on cold, still nights near that old Washington cabin, you might hear soft movement in the trees, a gentle giant keeping her promise. Because the forest, they say, still remembers kindness, and Willow never forgot.